They had been marching for days under a gray European sky when the word came down, surrender. For the German soldiers who had survived the firestorm of battle, the order meant not only the end of their fight, but also the collapse of everything drilled into them about honor, endurance, and loyalty to the Reich. Many were barely, more than boys, clutching worn boots and tattered coats. Others were veterans who had seen too much of Stalingrad, Normandy, or the ruins of their own cities. As Allied trucks and trains, filled with prisoners, began moving westward, rumors passed quietly between them. England, perhaps, or some camp in France. But then came the shock. They were not to be held in Europe at all. They were being loaded onto massive ships bound across the Atlantic. The journey itself was disorienting. On board the troop transports, the prisoners crowded into holds designed for men in uniform, but not for captives. The air was damp, heavy with salt and oil, and yet for many there was an odd sense of relief. The war was over. For them, there would be no more shells, no more desperate defense against advancing armies. Still, they whispered about what awaited them in America. Official propaganda had long painted the United States as a land of ruthless capitalists, where workers lived in misery and enemies were treated with cruelty. Some feared torture or execution. Others expected hunger and back-breaking labor. The Atlantic crossing stretched on, guarded by American sailors. The Germans noticed small details that unsettled their expectations. Meals were rationed, but strangely generous compared to the hunger they had known during the last months of the war. Bread was soft, butter appeared on tin trays, and even coffee was poured in thick mugs. The guards themselves were firm but not vicious, often treating prisoners with an almost casual indifference rather than hostility. These were not the monsters of Nazi propaganda. They were young men themselves, joking among each other, often offering a cigarette to one another without thought. Days blurred together on the ocean, and with them came a strange shift in the Germans' mindset. Fear remained, but it was mixed with a growing curiosity. What was this country where food seemed plentiful even in wartime and where guards carried themselves with such confidence? Some of the older prisoners remembered hearing about the wealth of America between the wars, about jazz, Hollywood, skyscrapers, and cars. But those were distant images, propaganda of a different sort. What they faced now was reality, though still wrapped in uncertainty. At last, the ships neared the American coastline. For many of the young men, it was the first time they had ever seen a foreign shore so far from Europe. The skyline of ports like New York or Boston rose out of the mist, filled with cranes, factories, and endless movement. To prisoners who came from bombed-out German towns where rubble still smoldered, the sight was overwhelming. They had expected perhaps to find destruction or poverty here as well. Instead, they saw vitality, industry, and power. The war seemed not to have touched this land in the same way. Disembarkation was efficient, carried out with military precision. German soldiers shuffled down gangplanks under the gaze of American MPs, loaded onto trains bound for the heartland. The landscapes flashing by the windows were unlike anything they had imagined. Wide fields, neat towns, billboards advertising products they had never heard of. On the train, some of the prisoners spoke in low voices about how different everything seemed from the bleak images of America they had been fed. The fear of cruelty began to fade, replaced by something unexpected, unease at their own ignorance. It was in those early days of capture and transportation that the prisoners first began to sense that captivity in America might not resemble the harsh punishment they had envisioned. Still, they could not know that among the most surprising revelations awaiting them were not whips or starvation, but rather simple object of everyday American life, cigarettes, that never seemed to run out, and a curious sweet substance called chewing gum. These small luxuries would soon become emblems of an alien abundance lodged forever in their memories. The first impressions of America were carved into the prisoners' minds even before they set foot in their camps. The journey inland took them through bustling stations where ordinary civilians went about their lives with a sense of calm that felt impossible to men who had lived under constant bombardment. From the windows of military trains, they saw children eating ice cream, shop, fronts brimming with goods, and cars gleaming in the sun. For Germans, who had come from cities hollowed by air raids and ration cards that allowed only scraps, it was as if they had landed on another planet. Arrival at the camps was less dramatic than many feared. Surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by watchtowers, the enclosures looked secure but not cruel. Rows of wooden barracks stretched out, their orderliness almost resembling a small village. Inside, the bunks were plain yet sturdier than expected. Each man was assigned a mattress, a blanket, and space of his own. Compared to the chaos of the front, the conditions seemed strangely civilized. The Americans maintained a firm discipline, but it was a discipline without hatred. Guards enforced rules with authority, but not with sadistic delight. It puzzled the Germans, who had expected humiliation. Or worse, food became the first major revelation. In the mess halls, prisoners lined up with trays and received meals that seemed impossibly generous. Potatoes, meat, bread that was fresh and white, vegetables that tasted as though they had just come from a farm. Such provisions were beyond anything the men had known for years. Many of them had grown accustomed to watery soups, ersatz coffee, and dry crusts at home. Hey, even in captivity, they were being given more than their families might be eating back in Germany. The contradiction was almost painful. Some could not help but feel guilt as they thought of hungry mothers and siblings back home. The guards themselves added to the dissonance. They were not the sadistic caricatures imagined through Nazi propaganda. Instead, they carried themselves with an air of confidence, even nonchalance. Some were farmer sons from Iowa, others factory workers from Ohio, yet all seemed united in their casual acceptance of abundance. They smoked freely, laughed with each other, and showed little interest in tormenting their captives. The distance between victor and vanquished was obvious, but it was not poisoned with cruelty. To the prisoners, this behavior seemed almost unfathomable. It was during these first days that the Germans noticed the rhythm of American life, even inside the wire. Cigarettes appeared constantly in the hands of guards and camp workers. The smell of tobacco drifted through the air, sharp and sweet, lingering on uniforms. Packs exchanged hands with the same ease as one might pass a coin. 4 German soldiers, who had often gone weeks with only a handful of smokes, the sight was astonishing. It suggested a world where such luxuries were not luxuries at all, but everyday items as common as bread. Equally bewildering were the camp canteens and small stores where prisoners could use their limited pay from labor to purchase goods. Even in these places, cigarettes were abundant, stacked in neat rows, while something else entirely foreign appeared on the shelves, brightly wrapped sticks of chewing gum. Few of the Germans had ever seen such a thing. Rumors spread quickly among the barracks. The Americans chewed endlessly on this sweet rubber, blowing bubbles and snapping their jaws with it. Some laughed, others scoffed, but curiosity grew. What was this strange habit? And why did it seem so normal here? As the days passed, fear gradually shifted into fascination. The prisoners had entered America expecting punishment, only to find themselves surrounded by hints of society so materially rich that even its prisoners lived with more comfort than many free citizens in Europe. Cigarettes and chewing gum, small as they were, stood out as symbols of this abundance. They would soon become obsessions, tokens of a civilization that had managed to fight a global war without collapsing into hunger and ruin. It began almost casually. A guard, leaning against the barracks wall, tapped a cigarette out of a pack and lit it with a match struck on his boot. The German prisoners nearby could not help but stare. The act itself was not foreign. They had smoked too whenever tobacco could be found, but the sheer nonchalance with which the American treated the cigarette was unsettling. He smoked slowly, savoring it, then carelessly flicked the stub away before it was even finished. To men who had once saved every shred of tobacco, our old half-burned butts, and traded crumpled papers for a single smoke, the gesture was almost obscene. Soon the scale of the abundance became impossible to ignore. Cigarettes were everywhere, Cartons arrived by the truckload, filling camp storerooms and guardhouses. Red and white packs of Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields. They seemed to flow without end. Guards distributed them to prisoners not only as part of rations, but sometimes casually, as if handing out small favors. At first, the Germans suspected it was a trick, a way to soften them before some harsher treatment. Yet, the supply never faltered. Day after day, week after week, the cigarettes appeared, as constant as the bread and coffee. For many of the prisoners, smoking became more than a pastime. It was a ritual, a way to reclaim a piece of identity amid captivity. Lighting a cigarette after a long day of camp labor gave them a fleeting sense of dignity. Conversations grew easy over smoke. Friendships formed in the thin haze drifting above barrack bunks. Even those who had not smoked before the war soon joined in, unable to resist the temptation of something that had once been scarce, but was now unlimited. The simple act of lighting up became a shared experience, binding men who had once marched under banners of conquest, but were now reduced in numbers behind. Wire. The abundance also transformed cigarettes into currency. Within days, an informal economy blossomed inside the camps. A man who could spare few smokes might barter them for extra bread, help with laundry, or even protection from bullies. Packs became more valuable than coins, which had no meaning here. The Americans seemed unconcerned, perhaps even amused by the miniature marketplace that developed. For the Germans, it was both survival and a window into the strange American habit of turning everything into trade. What unsettled them most was not just the presence of cigarettes, but the ease with which Americans parted with them. Guards smoked constantly, their fingers perpetually stained with nicotine, their laughter punctuated by streams of blue, gray smoke. They offered cigarettes to one another with a casual generosity that baffled the prisoners. Where in Germany men had hoarded the last shreds of tobacco like treasure, here it was handed over without thought. Cigarettes were not a prize of war, they were simply life. The contrast forced many to reconsider what they had been told about America. Nazi propaganda had painted the nation as decadent, corrupt, plagued by poverty and racial strife. Yet here, even prisoners of war lived in a cloud of tobacco that seemed inexhaustible. If the enemy could provide this to captives, what did that say about the strength and wealth of the country itself? In the long hours of camp life, as smoke curled to the rafters, the question lingered. In time, the endless supply of cigarettes became a symbol not merely of indulgence, but of something deeper, an economy so vast it could spare luxuries, even for its foes. To the German prisoners, still haunted by memories of scarcity and hunger back home, it was both comforting and unnerving. Cigarettes, once a rare indulgence, had become an emblem of the strange, almost unbelievable reality of captivity in America. If cigarettes astonished the prisoners with their sheer abundance, chewing gum baffled them with its novelty. To many Germans, it was an entirely alien concept. They had known hard candy, licorice, and peppermints before the war, but never the strange substance that seemed to dissolve and yet endure at the same time. The first time a guard pulled a bright stick from a colorful wrapper and began chewing, the prisoners exchanged puzzled glances. Was it food, medicine, some sort of American habit designed to mock them? Curiosity spread quickly. A few brave men accepted sticks of gum when offered, hesitant at first, expecting perhaps a burst of strange flavor or something unpleasant. Instead, they found sweetness, sharp, minty, sometimes fruity that lingered on the tongue. And then came the bewilderment. The gum did not disappear. It softened, lost some taste, but it remained in the mouth, pliant and chewable, hour after hour. The Germans could hardly believe it. To them, food was meant to be swallowed, nourishment consumed until nothing remained. Yet here was a luxury design, not for survival, but for endless enjoyment. Rumors ran through the barracks. Some insisted chewing gum was made of rubber. Others swore it had medicinal purposes. A few whispered that it was a trick meant to keep their jaws busy and their thoughts dulled. But for most it became a fascination. The men watched guards chew for hours rhythmically working. their jaws while walking, talking, or standing watch. The sound of cracking gum, the sight of bubbles being blown and popped was at once comical and mesmerizing. When the canteens began offering gum for purchase, demand surged. Prisoners pulled their small earnings from camp labor to buy the brightly wrapped sticks, treating them almost like contraband. A single piece could be traded for a favor or treasured in secret, chewed slowly to prolong the experience. Some saved the wrappers as souvenirs, marveling at the colorful American designs, the bold fonts and cheerful slogans, compared to the gray utilitarian packaging of wartime Germany. They seemed like artifact from another world. For those who tasted gum, for the first time, the experience carried a strange psychological weight. It was not just a novelty of flavor. It was the implication. Here was a society so wealthy, so confident that it could create products serving no practical purpose other than pleasure. At home, families rationed bread and potatoes, children scred for scraps in bombed-out streets. Yet in America, people could waste resources on something designed purely to be chewed and thrown away. To the prisoners, this luxury was both enviable and unsettling, a constant reminder of their homelands. Ruin. Chewing gum became, in its own way, a cultural bridge. Some prisoners adopted the habit eagerly, mimicking the Americans, learning how to blow bubbles, laughing when they burst across their faces. Others refused, considering it childish or demeaning, a symbol of defeat. But even those who scorned it could not ignore the larger message. America had more than enough. Enough to indulge its soldiers, its guards, even its enemies. The gum, like cigarettes, turned into a kind of quiet revelation. It was not a weapon, not a piece of propaganda forced upon them, but an everyday indulgence that spoke volumes about the society they now glimpsed from behind the wire. It was small, sweet, and trivial, yet its impact lingered, reshaping how many prisoners thought about the world beyond their ruined homeland. By the time the shock of cigarettes and gum had settled into routine, the rhythm of camp life began to define itself. Days started early, with guards calling the men out for roll call beneath the stock watchtowers. Prisoners lined up in neat rows, counting off with weary voices before dispersing into their assigned tasks. Some worked in fields outside the wire, picking crops or tending livestock for nearby American farms. Others labored in workshops, repairing equipment, or building wooden furniture. A few were even sent to help with construction, their labor compensated with small wages credited to camp accounts. It was through these wages that cigarettes and gum became not only symbols of abundance, but active participants in daily survival. The canteens stocked them in seemingly endless supply along with soap, candy, and small necessities. Each man quickly learned that to make life in the camp tolerable, one had to engage in this economy. A pack of Lucky Strikes could be traded for an extra blanket, a stick of gum for a polished pair of boots, a carton for a week of someone else's chores. The Americans allowed these exchanges to flourish, perhaps understanding that it kept order by giving men something to aspire toward, no matter how trivial. Inside the barracks, the culture of trade grew into a microcosm of society. Cigarettes were the currency of choice, as stable and reliable as any mark or dollar. Men who hoarded their smokes became wealthy in influence, while those who wasted them quickly found themselves dependent. Gum, though less practical, held its own mystique. A piece offered at the right moment could forge a friendship, ease tensions, or buy loyalty. In the claustrophobic world of captivity, even such small gestures carried weight. The Americans, watching from the outside, seemed amused by this internal economy. Guards would sometimes toss a few packs of cigarettes into a crowd just to watch the scramble, a mixture of entertainment and indulgence. But for the prisoners, the items represented more than simple pleasure. They were tangible proof of America's strength. Even in war with millions of soldiers deployed overseas, the nation could still supply luxuries to both its own men and its enemies. That fact gnawed at German pride more than any insult or punishment ever could. Daily routines reinforced the contrast. In the mornings, coffee was poured in steaming tin mugs, its aroma filling the halls. Lunch often included meat, vegetables, and bread, so white it seemed decadent compared to the coarse loaves of rye they had known. Work. Assignments ended with rest periods where men sat smoking, chewing, and talking about home. Evenings brought letters, carefully censored, but still a lifeline to families far away. In between, cigarettes and gum provided not just comfort, but continuity, something to structure long hours of waiting. Slowly, the prisoners began to adapt. They decorated their barracks with drawings, built small gardens, and played games with makeshift equipment. Cigarettes often served as stakes in poker matches or wagers over soccer, games held in the yard. Gum wrappers were folded into tiny sculptures, tokens, passed between friends or kept as mementos. For men stripped of freedom, these small rituals created meaning. The abundance of such trivial luxuries made many wonder what awaited them at home. They imagined families in ruined Germany, cities searching for bread crusts while they, as captives, enjoyed what felt like riches. The dissonance weighed heavily, sparking debates in hushed tones. Was captivity here humiliation, or was it a strange mercy? Either way, cigarettes and gum remained ever present, silent reminders that they were living inside the borders of a world that had not been broken by war. As weeks turned into months, the German prisoners began to see the true scale of the cultural divide between their homeland and the America that now surrounded them. It was not simply a matter of barbed wire and uniforms. It was a stark contrast in how people lived, what they valued, and what they seemed to take for granted. Cigarettes and gum had already hinted at this, but the longer the men observed, the deeper their unease grew. They compared stories from home whispered at night on their bunks. One man remembered the bitter winters of the final war years when his family huddled in a cellar, dividing a crust of bread into portions so small they could barely be seen. Another recalled mothers boiling weeds to make soup while children picked through rubble searching for anything edible. In Germany, tobacco had become a rare luxury reserved for officers or the black market. Even hardened soldiers often smoked scraps of dried leaves, stuffed into paper, coughing at the acrid taste. And here, in captivity, guards threw away half-burned cigarettes as if they were worthless. The prisoners could not escape the humiliation of this comparison. They had fought under banners promising German supremacy, told again and again that theirs was the most advanced, most disciplined nation on earth. Yet now they sat behind wire, watching a society that seemed richer, freer, and more confident than anything they had known. The chewing gum epitomized this reality. It was not necessary, not practical. Yet millions of Americans consumed it without thought. For the Germans, it was an almost mocking display of prosperity. Discussions often circled back to propaganda. Many remembered posters and speeches declaring that America was a decaying society of corruption, plagued by unemployment and misery. But how could that be reconciled with the overflowing camp stores, the fresh food, the endless stream of cigarettes? Some argued it was all facade, that prisoners were being shown only the surface. Others insisted the truth was undeniable, the rye had lied, and America was far stronger than anyone had imagined. For younger soldiers, the cultural shock took on a more personal tone. They saw American guards with clean uniforms, easy smiles, and pockets jingling with coins they spent on candy and soda at camp vending machines. They watched them write letters home, confident that their families lived in houses untouched by bombs, surrounded by shops and schools still functioning. These small observations hit harder than lectures. They were glimpses of a reality entirely at odds with the shattered streets of Dresden or Hamburg. Even the act of chewing gum became a symbol of difference. Americans chewed while on duty, while chatting, while lounging in the sun. The rhythmic snapping of gum became the soundtrack of captivity, and though some Germans mocked it as childish, others envied the casual freedom it represented. To chew without worry, to waste time and resources on something unnecessary. That was power. It showed a nation so secure in its wealth that it could indulge in habits that seemed frivolous to men raised on scarcity. The more they saw, the more the prisoners realized that captivity in America was not simply about waiting for the war to end. It was a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. The world they had been taught to despise had surpassed them, not only in arms, but in the very fabric of daily life. Cigarettes and gum were not just luxuries. They were proof of abundance, symbols of a culture that had thrived, even as it collapsed into ruin. When mail finally reached the camps, the prisoners discovered another painful contrast. Letters from home arrived. Sporadically, often delayed, always censored. Each envelope carried with it the faint smell of war-torn Europe. Ink smudged, paper brittle, handwriting. Anxious, families wrote cautiously, aware that every line would be read by Allied censors. They spoke of health in vague terms, of surviving despite hardship. But between the lines, the Germans could read the truth. Hunger, fear, and the slow erosion of hope. The prisoners, in tone, sat at crude desks, under guard supervision, and wrote their own letters back across the Atlantic. They described their days carefully, aware of censorship, yet it was impossible to hide everything. Some admitted that they were being fed well, far better than they had expected. Others hinted at the strange abundance surrounding them, though often cloaking it in careful words so as not to sound boastful. We are treated with decency, one might write. There is enough food, even small. Comforts. But the real secret lay in what they left unsaid, the endless cigarettes and gum that had become the camp's currency and symbol. Still, those luxuries found their way into letters indirectly. A prisoner might mention that his health was improving, his nerves calmer, his spirit steadier. His family, struggling back home, would not know that much of. This peace came from the haze of tobacco smoke and the idle chewing of gum. Some wrote more boldly, speaking of cigarettes available even to prisoners, as if to reassure their families that captivity was survivable. The irony was bitter. Men behind WWII were smoking freely while their fathers and brothers in Germany lit scraps of newspaper rolled into tubes. There was also envy, though rarely confessed openly. The men knew that describing too much abundance could wound their loved ones who endured ration cards and bombings. Yet among themselves they admitted the truth. Life in captivity was in some ways easier than life at home. One man confessed to another that he felt guilty chewing gum, while imagining his wife dividing a single potato among children. Another admitted that he had smoked more in a week of captivity than he had in the entire last year fighting. These confessions spread quietly like smoke curling to the rafters. The Americans, of course, censored anything that hinted at military matters, but they allowed descriptions of daily life to pass through. Perhaps it was deliberate, a way of letting German civilians know that their men were being treated well, sowing seeds of doubt about Nazi propaganda. And indeed, families who received such letters could not help but wonder if their sons wrote of coffee, cigarettes, and gum. What did that say about the enemy's strength? What did it say about the world beyond the rice borders? The result was a strange duality. The prisoners lived with the constant ache of separation, the knowing fear for their families, yet also with the guilty knowledge that they were in some ways better off. Cigarettes and gum, those trivial luxuries, became symbols of that gulf. They were reminders that America's abundance reached even into the camps while Germany starved. And in every letter, every censored word lingered the unspoken truth. Captivity here was not just survival, but a revelation of a world their homeland could no longer match. When the war ended and repatriation began, the prisoners carried their belongings in small bundles, clothes, letters, perhaps a book or two, but what they carried most heavily were memories. They boarded ships once more, this time heading back across the Atlantic, filled with anticipation and unease. Some longed to see their families. Others feared what ruins awaited them. Yet almost all of them shared one strange lingering thought. The image of cigarettes and chewing gum, ever present. Symbols of their captivity. Back in Germany, the contrast was brutal. Cities lay in rubble. Food lines stretched through streets, and homes were patched together from bombed shells. Families embraced their returning sons with tears, but behind the joy lay despair. The prisoners quickly realized that their stories of American abundance could not be easily shared. To speak openly about cigarettes by the carton and gum in bright wrappers would sound like fantasy, or worse, betrayal. Still among close friends, the tale slipped out of guards who smoked endlessly, of stores stocked with goods, of prisoners who had never gone hungry. The listeners staring at empty cupboards could scarcely believe it. For many of the former captives, the experience reshaped their understanding of the world. They had entered America, expecting cruelty, and found instead a society that overflowed with luxuries, even in wartime. Cigarettes and gum became more than memories of indulgence. They became lessons. These small items revealed the strength of an economy, untouched by devastation, the power of a culture confident enough to spare comforts for its enemies. To men who had once believed in German superiority, it was a sobering revelation. Some carried the lessons into their new lives. Years later, when prosperity slowly returned to West Germany, former PWs would recall the taste of American gum, the sight of guards tossing cigarettes without a thought. They told their children how strange it had felt to chew endlessly on something that never disappeared, how intoxicating it was to smoke without rationing. For them, these experiences became shorthand for the larger truth that America had won, not only with bombs and tanks, but with abundance. Others spoke of the psychological weight of those luxuries. To be surrounded by wealth while knowing one's homeland starved was both comforting and humiliating. It bred resentment in some, admiration in others, but in all it left a mark. Cigarettes and gum became emblems of captivity, but also of a turning point in their lives, a confrontation with realities that propaganda had denied. In post-war memoirs and oral histories, the themes surface again and again. German soldiers remembered not only battles lost or comrades buried, but also the peculiar shock of being given too much in captivity. They remembered writing letters home, carefully omitting details of abundance. They remembered the guilty pleasure of blowing bubbles with gum, the absurdity of trading cigarettes like currency. These memories lingered long, after uniforms were put away and new lives begun. In the end, the story of German prisoners in America was not only about defeat and survival. It was about discovery. The endless cigarettes and strange sweetness of gum revealed more than indulgence. They revealed a world operating on an entirely different scale of prosperity. And though the prisoners returned to their own soil, they carried with them the undeniable knowledge that they had glimpsed a future their homeland would take decades to rebuild. Cigarettes and gum, so small, so ordinary, had become the unlikely symbols of a shattered generation's confrontation with truth.